So if we could start at the beginning, I think you were born in 1955 in Glasgow on, well, what's now part of Glasgow. Originally, obviously, was a village on the side, but I guess it was part of Glasgow by the time you
Oh
appeared.
yes, no, it was pretty industrial. I lived out in the east end of Glasgow. It was a fairly rough part of town, and I think people would still say that now. But it never felt like it when you were growing up in it. When you look back, it does. But at the time, it was just a very normal place to be.
So did you have a happy childhood? You had some. You're one of eight, I think. Is that right? You had
Yes, yeah.
many brothers and sisters.
Yeah, one of eight children. Dad was a teacher. My mum was a nurseman. She wasn't producing children. And at the time, we didn't have a lot of money. We lived in a council house. Now there was 10 of us sharing a toilet. So again, when you look back, when I talk to my kids about it, think, oh my goodness, that must have been hard. But I think we were loved. We were well educated. My mum, made much of our clothing, and but we were well fed. It never felt like poverty. It felt like a very normal life.
And did you sort of run wild in the country? What were your hobbies and how did you spend your leisure time as a child?
Yeah, well, in those days in Glasgow, if you're a young lad, you probably spent almost all of your non-school time playing football. And in those days, that it wasn't even an organised football park, so it was just in any patch of ground, which there wasn't a lot of green grass spaces out in Rochesy in Glasgow. But and again, if you never owned a ball, but you would always join in a group. But it was just what you did. It was just everyone playing, on the streets or in a park, and you could quite often have two or three different games going on in the one space. It was almost like a game of 3D chess. I look back with amusement at how inventive uh, children can be.
But you never owned your own football, is that right?
No, no. Well, I mean, as I say, we didn't have a lot of money. I think the money we had went on food and clothing, and so there wasn't a lot of room for accessories like toys or things. But there was enough people around that there was plenty of footballs around. There's always somebody who was able to have one.
And you went to the local state schools.
Yes, I did. Yeah, and I went to the state schools
And
because
did you
that's
get
what you did. When you came from that background, and the education I got then has certainly not held me back. It was a very good education system. I thought the Scottish education system in general is pretty strong, and around Glasgow, I think we had some great schools because of the critical mass, probably.
what sort of A levels did you study? Were you interested in tech from the beginning?
No, not really. I mean, in my days, it was called hires in those days, and I think I did maths, which I was very good at. I did French and Latin, which I was decent at. Latin was hard, but it was just a very good intellectual discipline, I think, and it's been very helpful for English and for understanding where words come from. And then I did something called modern studies, which was about really politics and economics and economic history, and it gave me a great hunger what was going on in the world out there. Because in these days, this was the mid 60s, and you had the whole Russian, Eastern Europe, Soviet bloc thing, which was very interesting. You had the Cold War. So I got a taste for politics and economics through that at school.
And what about technology? Did you come across computers at school?
No, no, they really hadn't been in those days. There was certainly no, the PC hadn't come along at that stage. There was no mobile phones. I think most people in most normal walks of life would not have known what a computer was for, would never have seen one. In those days, even when I left and went to university, computers were things that big banks and huge companies had hidden away in some air conditioned, water cooled, special factory setup. So most people had no exposure to technology of any sort. When I think back as a curious teenager in Glasgow, my exposure to technology would be the television and the radio. And when I was living at home in the mid 60s, there were two TV channels, and it was black and white, of course. So we had BBC and we had ITV. And then a thing called BBC Two came along. And then I think in the early mid 60s, colour television started coming along. But again, in a working class household like ours, we wouldn't have had a colour TV and anything. So TV and radio was about your exposure to technology. But when in school, we occasionally, had a film of what's going on in Africa or Canada, and this was quite exciting. And we went to the cinema occasionally, but that was it. There was nothing beyond that to inspire you technology wise.
No. Okay. So, and before we sort of leave your school days, you did, you obviously were doing jobs, I suppose, to earn pocket money because you were not given pocket money by your
Yeah.
parents, I think. And I think you did a milk round when you were sort of 10. So
I did,
you
yes.
had
So
odd jobs.
I was pushing a milk float around the streets of Glasgow at 6 o'clock in the morning, delivering milk. And nowadays it would be seen as slave labour, would have been completely banned. But actually, it was a good source of income, and it was the only way that you had any pocket money. I then graduated from there to a much more white collar occupation of being a paper round boy. So I then got to deliver newspapers, which was not quite as physically onerous. And you know, you had to collect money at the door and stuff. Again, this was at the age of 11 or 12, so it taught me, it gave me a bit of responsibility, I think, which was as well as some pocket money. So it was a good discipline.